Back in 1992, I was a poor college student right in my second year of my computer science degree. My classes would consist of mathematics and computing. I was learning about languages like C and took classes on computer graphics and discrete mathematics. Yep, you guessed it, I was a nerd. On campus, we had computer labs full of Unix workstations and 286 and 386 PCs running MS-DOS and Windows. At home, I didn't own a PC. I owned an Amiga, an A500 to be precise. My history growing up with an Amiga in the household is something that longtime viewers know all about. It was the only machine I ever felt that I needed. The A500 was pimped out with an accelerator card, some extra RAM, and a 40 meg hard drive. It could multitask, was able to emulate a Mac and PC, and even read my Mac and PC formatted discs from school. By 1992, the Amiga was still a popular machine, and its new line, the A1200, introduced the AGA chipset. Faster processor, more colors, more RAM, built-in hard drive. But unfortunately, it wasn't really the upgrade that many were looking for. I still wanted one, of course, but I couldn't help but feel a little disappointed. But in 1992, even if you didn't upgrade to an Amiga 1200, everyone would play some amazing games. Amiga was a fantastic horizontal shoot-'em-up that you could put right next to R-Type in the arcade. Pinball Dreams was a technically brilliant pinball game with realistic physics. Eye of the Beholder 2, a fantastic dungeon crawler fighting monsters in the Castle of Darkmoon. Flashback, the 2D rotoscope science fiction cinematic platform game from the masters of storytelling Delphine Software. And Populous 2, the bigger and better sequel to Peter Molyneux's original game. These are just a few highlights. If you owned an Amiga in 1992, you were certainly eating good. And you would still laugh at your friends who owned PCs. But the good times wouldn't last much longer. In May of 1992, the PC rose from the canvas and knocked out the Amiga with one punch. Wolfenstein 3D released on May 5th, 1992. That's over 32 years ago. It sent shockwaves through the industry. Developed by id Software, suddenly the PC had grown up and was starting to be taken seriously as a true games machine. Wolfenstein, of course, wasn't rendering what we would consider to be true 3D. It used a rendering system known as raycasting and billboarded sprites to cast off the illusion of a 3D world. But its performance was impressive even on a high-end 286 PC. I remember at the time, many in the Amiga circles were very quick to say that Wolfenstein was cheating and that the Amiga would still have the edge with its ability to render and fill vectors and do proper 3D. But this was really just a coping mechanism at best. Somehow, the IBM PC, with its lack of any real custom chips outside of exotic sound cards, had leapfrogged the Amiga, and suddenly, 1992 was the beginning of the end, which of course we would soon find out when Commodore declared bankruptcy in 1994 after they posted a $375 million loss to investors that year. So what exactly happened? How did the PC turn into such an amazing games machine seemingly overnight, and how did it crush any momentum that the Amiga may have had in 1992? Well, it's all thanks to the PC's VGA screen mode 13H. The PC has no blitter, no hardware sprites, but it does have a mode where you can allocate a 320 by 200 pixel frame buffer and plot pixels from a palette of 256 colors into that frame buffer with only a single memory write per pixel. This mode is also referred to what is known as chunky mode. If we go back to our example of the random pixels being displayed, you can see here that we're setting the screen mode to 13H, and this while loop is plotting pixels with a random 8-bit color value to any random XY position on the screen. Of course, in this day and age, frame buffers like this are standard, and any graphics APIs such as OpenGL, DirectX, or Vulkan allows the developer to work with frame buffers in this fashion. The Amiga, on the other hand, did not. Instead, it used bit planes. Simply put, when you're rendering to the Amiga's graphics hardware, you need a color palette, and that palette has to be defined with a certain number of colors. So for example, if you want a 16 color palette, that means you need 4 bit planes, because each bit plane represents a 1 or a 0. If you want 32 colors, you need 5 bit planes. This particular mode is known as planar mode. Now the Amiga was a 2D powerhouse. It could do a lot of really cool things. And it even had the ability to draw connected lines and fill them quite quickly using the blitter. But one thing that the Amiga struggled to do was render chunky graphics. If we assume a 16 color palette with 4 bit planes, and we're asking the hardware to plot a red pixel on the screen, the hardware needs to make one read operation in bit plane 1, and then a read operation in bit plane 2, and then a read operation in bit plane 3, and a read operation in bit plane 4, just to calculate the color value of a single pixel. And then this operation needs to be repeated for the amount of times that you're drawing on the screen. At the time, it was generally agreed upon that the Amiga 500 couldn't run Wolfenstein. It didn't have enough colors, it didn't have a native chunky mode, and most importantly, it didn't have the processing power. At only 7.14 MHz, even with its custom chips, it seemed impossible, and for years, it was. There were a few efforts to prove the naysayers wrong. Some commercial games released with an attempt at a similar raycasting engine, some with some interesting results, and experienced coders would come up with fast, chunky 2-planar routines, and the demo scene would show off some interesting results. But this would not be ideal for the Amiga 500 and its 16-bit processor, so game publishers, demo coders, and hobbyists would look to the Amiga 1200 with its faster 32-bit 68020 and wider 32-bit bus and improved AGA chipset. Many believed that the Amiga 1200 would be capable of running Wolfenstein 3D, but unfortunately it never came, at least officially. At the end of 1993, id Software released Doom. The Amiga still didn't have Wolfenstein, but it did have expandability. Accelerated cards were becoming cheaper and quite popular, the sweet spot being the 68030 cards clocked at 33 and 50 MHz. If you had the cash, you could even pick up a 68040 or even a 68060 card, which cost thousands of dollars. But this wasn't all. Dedicated graphics cards started to appear, known as RTG or retargetable graphics. These cards would take the heavy lifting of rendering graphics off the Amiga and onto the card itself. And the best part was, most of them would come built in with chunky modes. Surely by now, Wolfenstein 3D and Doom were attainable. But in 1994, John Carmack famously said that the Amiga wasn't powerful enough to run Doom, and singled out the need for an expensive 68040 class processor, and criticized the Amiga for its lack of chunky mode. This response sent the Amiga community into a frenzy. Many believed he was wrong and that Doom was indeed possible. Others felt that while Doom was unattainable, surely Wolfenstein 3D could be considered playable, right? But in 1994, John Carmack wasn't wrong. Unless you had a high-end Amiga that cost a few $1,000s, the hardware was never meant to run 3D texture-mapped FPS-style games. Even if id Software invested in delivering either Doom or Wolfenstein to the Amiga, it would only ever tap into a very small percentage of users who had Amigas capable of running the game at the time. But by now, the Amiga 1200 was the standard, and the gauntlet had been thrown down. Developers and publishers knew that Doom would never come to the Amiga, and certainly not Wolfenstein 3D, at least by John Carmack and id Software's hand. Over the next few years, the Amiga would see a flurry of Doom clones. Now this is a bit misleading to say this, but it's the best way to describe the games that we would see. Most of them used raycasting methods. Gloom is a technically impressive raycasting game that ran at somewhat decent speeds on a stock Amiga 1200 with extra RAM. It was scalable and it ran well on pretty much any system that you had, even taking advantage of retargetable graphics. Gloom 3 would see many improvements to the Gloom engine, and the Gloom series would end up being somewhat popular on the Amiga. But it was scalable and took advantage of accelerated cards and retargetable graphics cards, and it ran pretty well no matter what setup you had, even if it meant reducing the viewport to the size of a postage stamp. Team 17 would release Alien Breed 3D in 1995, and for me, this game has the best feeling of a Wolfenstein or a Doom clone above and beyond anything else that I've played on the Amiga. It also had good speed, but again, the window size is just a bit larger than a postage stamp, and those chunky graphics are quite chunky. Team 17 would follow this up with Alien Breed 3D 2 a few years later, but this was a much more ambitious effort with some pretty cool lighting, but it was quite slow on anything less than a 68040 Amiga with an RTG card. Breathless is probably one of the more technical, impressive Doom clones on the Amiga. Released in 1995, it runs well even on a stock Amiga 1200 with fast RAM, and it scales nicely on a fast 030 or higher. The problem is, and what we will find out with many of these Doom clones on the Amiga, is that the gameplay isn't much fun. Repetitive enemies and the environments lack any atmosphere. The player movement is also far too slow. For me, this is more of a nice tech demo, and it was something that actually came bundled with accelerator cards back in the day. Genetic Species is probably one of the best looking Wolfenstein 3D raycasting clones I've seen in a while. It's a well-made 3D shooter with lots of atmosphere. The lighting is especially nice for a 1998 Amiga FPS game. It also scales well even on a stock Amiga with 4 megs of RAM and could run fairly well with an accelerated card. The gameplay itself isn't very special. It's very similar to what you would expect. Shoot enemies, find keycards, and locate the exit to the next level. Fears is a 1995 Doom clone that is technically quite good. It uses a more advanced 3D engine with levels, stairs, slopes, and water. It ran well on an accelerated Amiga, but the developers really pulled in the camera perspective in an interesting way, and it almost feels like a Sega Superscaler arcade game over a conventional FPS. But it wasn't just commercial games that were trying to replicate Wolfenstein 3D. The Amiga community was as well. This is Text Demo 5, written by John Hendricks. It's a simple demo showing off texture map walls and floors running on a 68030 class Amiga. It allows for multiple walls and floor textures and also allows floors to be any height. Now of course, these were all very valiant efforts, but at the end of the day, it was still not Wolfenstein 3D, and it certainly wasn't Doom. In 1997, the Doom source code was released on December the 23rd, and this meant that the Amiga finally got its Doom. A Doom is the best version of Doom that is available on the Amiga, and it runs pretty well, but if we're talking about performance, it's benchmarked to run at about 5 frames per second with a full window size on high detail on a 68030 class machine running at 28 MHz and around 10 FPS at 50 MHz. And to round out this story, Wolfenstein 3D finally would see an Amiga release, and this is the most up-to-date version known as Amiga Wolf 3D. Now this was released in 2022, and it's a very well optimized, only requiring a stock Amiga 1200 that required at least 1 MB of additional memory. So for me, it's obvious. Of course, Commodore's failure to innovate would result in their demise. The Amiga 1200, the CD32 and the AGA chipset was not the upgrade people were wanting. They wanted more. But ultimately, Doom didn't kill the Amiga, Wolfenstein did. All the way back in 1992, computer graphics were evolving, and none of Commodore's machines were really able to match it. The 7-year-old Amiga architecture was useless for that type of FPS game, and game developers knew it, even though they tried to come up with their own solutions. By the time Doom had released in 1993, the Amiga was already dead. But there is somewhat of a happy ending here. As it turns out, you can run a fast FPS game on a stock Amiga without a CPU upgrade, and John Carmack may have been wrong all these years. This is Grind, currently a work-in-progress title that demonstrates a very polished FPS running at between 25 to 30 FPS on a stock Amiga with fast memory. the game promises to run at identical performance on a bare-bones Amiga 500 as well, with some added memory. This is technical wizardry at play here, and I guess that if Grind released all the way back in 1992 as a commercial product, it would have sold extremely well. Grind is one of those games that genuinely has me excited to play. It does look quite fantastic. While Wolfenstein and Doom never did see commercial releases on the Amiga, Quake, of all games, did. It was ported to the Amiga by Clickboom Software, and it's a very faithful version of the PC original with all the features here. However, the game does require a very fast processor. A 68060 class is recommended for frame rates over 15 FPS at full screen. It would also take advantage of the Amiga's PowerPC chipset and accelerator cards if you were rich enough to afford a high-end PowerPC accelerator board or motherboard. Now, if you do believe that Wolfenstein killed the Amiga or not really is up to your interpretation. Obviously, there are other factors at play that we haven't really talked about, including software piracy, the mismanagement of Commodore, and the disappointing AGA chipset upgrade that simply wasn't good enough. But for many gamers that did own an Amiga, once they saw Wolfenstein 3D running on the PC, it was all over. The landscape of the computer video games had changed. No longer was 2D popular. It was all about 3D texture map first-person shooters. And with that, we are going to leave it here for today's episode. I love going back and revisiting old Amiga history because it is very much a nostalgia trip for me in many different ways. Now, if you agree that Wolfenstein killed the Amiga or not, let me know your thoughts about it in the comments below. But we are going to leave it here. Thank you so much for watching. If you liked it, please don't forget to leave me a thumbs up, and we'll catch you guys in the next episode. Bye for now.